Hello, welcome back for another evening of Reading Journey to Nagwanis with me, Valerie Monroe, and me, Bookwormy. We're glad you're back because we were getting to a good part. That's right. Brogden was trying to figure out how to get some sort of signal to John and Elaine so that they could help him with the poor hairy man who's very wounded at this point. And yesterday, when we had read, the last line we read is, how could he get in touch with his friend? Brogden scrambled out of the bush. Stay here, he instructed Che. Then he pointed at the hairy man, who was in a ball on the ground, gripping his ankle. Remember that there were there was an arrow in his ankle. Stay here with him. Che immediately landed next to the hairy man. Without a further sound, he looked up at Brogden with what appeared to be complete understanding. I'll be back as soon as I can, Brogden promised. Then he took off running and tried not to think about the pool of blood that was continuing to spread across the ground. He and John had devised an emergency plan months before, but thankfully they never had to use it. In fact, Brogden had completely forgotten that he had the tools for the plan in the tiny hip pocket of his pants. He had gotten so used to the weight of them that he didn't even notice them anymore. Remembering this made him feel incredibly embarrassed because he could have used them before. Like when he and Finley had been out on Six Raven Island, for example. He had sewn the hip pocket shut for two reasons. The first was that the contents were for absolute emergencies only, and he could not afford to lose them. The second was that his aunts, especially Aunt Gladys, would have taken the tools away if they ever discovered them. They would have never allowed him to carry a pocket knife around, for example, not even a tiny one. Also sewn into his pocket was a piece of flint, which could be used to start a fire. That can help me send a smoke signal, Brogden thought excitedly. John lived on Sunset Island, which was at the other end of Lake Wahakmo, so Brogden needed to start the fire in a place high enough for John to see it. Before he could begin climbing the hill, however, he needed to do something first. He pulled off his shirt and ran to the lake. Then he pushed the shirt into the water. A huge bubble of air rose to the surface and popped. He held the shirt under to make sure the fabric was thoroughly soaked, and when he lifted it back out, he did not wring it. It had to be as saturated as possible. He took the heavy dripping shirt and began climbing upward. There was no time to look for a cleared path. He had to duck under bushes and climb over rocks. It would be helpful, he thought, as he began the ascent, if he could find a deer to carry him. Unfortunately, there was no time to search for one. His excitement propelled him along. First, he traveled through a slope of freshly cut grass that belonged to a house dweller. He stayed to the left and hugged the bushes so as not to be discovered. This led him to a stone driveway, which ended at a road that was used by house dwellers in their cars. Brogden made sure to look both ways. When he was certain the road was clear, Brogden ran like mad across the black asphalt road to another house dweller's yard. It was on a sharp incline, and he had to squeeze through the slats of a white wooden fence to get into it. Once on the other side, he continued hiking upward. There were several large bushes in the yard, the leaves of which had changed to a dull, dusty brown. Brogden zigzagged from one bush to the other, trying not to be seen. The early morning hours were marching in, the skies transforming from black to a light gray. The stars were no longer visible. In a short time, Brogden knew that a glowing pink would appear and the house dwellers would begin their day. When he reached the last bush in the yard, he stopped to catch his breath. About 10 feet or so in front of him was a rock wall that separated the yard from the next one, which was a few feet above him. There were spaces between the rocks that would serve as footholds. Scaling the wall would be easy. He plotted it out and set off running toward the rock wall, his wet shirt flapping as he went. Just as he grabbed hold of a rock and hoisted his foot into a crevice, a giant golden retriever came bounding into the yard. "Hurry up, boy," a house-dwelling man in a blue bathrobe called out from the back door of the house. "I've got to get to work. Can't waste time today." The dog loped over to one of the bushes, began to sniff around. You know what that means. "Good boy," yelled the man. "Hurry up." A woman in a flowered bathrobe appeared beside him, and the man smiled at her. "See? It's finally housebroken. The training class has paid off." "You're right," replied the woman. "He hasn't gone in the house in a few days now." "Except it takes him a long time to come back in," he noted. "Well, give him a minute," she chuckled. "He has to find the right spot." "You give him a minute," laughed the man. He took a sip from his coffee mug he was holding. "I've got to get dressed and get on the road. I have a meeting." And then he disappeared back in the house. As the dog wandered from bush to bush, Brogden froze in place on the rock wall. The hand holding the wet shirt was above him, and drops of water fell onto his forehead. Finally, the dog found an acceptable spot, relieved himself, and turned to head back into the house. Confident that the dog was on his way inside, Brogden resumed the climb. Hand over hand and foot over foot, he scaled the wall. The dog was almost to the door when he either caught Brogden's scent or heard the scratchy sound of Brogden's shoes against the rocks. He turned and made a beeline for Brogden, barking loudly enough to wake all the nearby house dwellers. He sprang onto the wall where Brogden hung inches from the top and pawed at Brogden's feet. "Down, down, boy," hissed Brogden. "Go away." Come on in, boy," called the woman. The dog jumped up and down like a jack-in-the-box. "What is it, boy?" the woman asked. "What's over there that's so interesting? A squirrel? Chipmunk? Groundhog? Well, forget about it and come inside." But the dog remained resolute. He sat on his haunches and stared into Brogden's eyes. He cocked his head to the side and whined. The woman, despite being in her bedclothes, could take no more and strode quickly across the yard. "Let's go, boy. Whatever it is, let it—" Then she stopped in her tracks when she spied Brogden. "What in the— I can't believe— Edward!" She began to scream. "Edward, come quickly! There's a little man out here! A leprechaun, I believe! Edward!" Brogden looked up. Just one more step up, and he would be over the rock wall. But the woman was coming toward him in such a hurry now, with her arms outstretched. "Oh, don't worry, little man. I won't hurt you," she called out. "Edward!" "I'm tying my tie," Edward replied from somewhere in the house. "But Edward, the little man, please bring me my camera," she hollered, "and hurry." "I can't," called Edward. "I'm looking for my keys." "Fine," she replied. "I'll get it myself." And then she pointed to Brogden, who had not uttered a word or moved a muscle since being spotted. "Now, just stay still," she ordered, backing away in the direction of the sliding door on her patio. "My camera is just inside on the pantry shelf, where I keep it handy for photographing birds. It'll only take a minute to grab it." The moment the woman disappeared inside to retrieve the camera, however, Brogden hightailed it over the top of the wall. It took Brogden the better part of the morning to cross 2 more streets and steal through 3 more yards. Each house dweller's yard seemed to rise up at an even steeper slope than the last. Luckily, he did not encounter any more of them or their pets. It was possible, Brogden thought, that many of the house dwellers were at work, school, or sleeping. Whatever the case, he was more than happy no one spotted him climbing to the top of a huge flat rock in the backyard of the house at the very top of the hill. From there, he had a panoramic view of Lake Wahakmo, thanks in part to the fact that many of the tree's branches were bare. John and Elaine were probably busy taking care of Maggie, but Brogden hoped against hope that they would take a break. If they were spending some time outside, they would certainly see his signal for help. He left his shirt on top of the rock. It was still quite soaked. Next, he set to work collecting materials for a fire. Fistfuls of dry grass, a small brown mushroom, and a few twigs, including some that were still green from a nearby bush. He climbed back onto the rock with his supplies, arranged the dried grass in a pile, and positioned the mushroom on top. Then, using his knife, he scraped the flint until he saw sparks. They caught onto the mushroom and quickly warmed it up. He continued blowing on the sparks until a little fire began to spread to the dried grasses. The fire grew larger as he added the twigs to the pile. When a dense white smoke rose from the flames, he placed the wet shirt over the entire blaze. A puff of white smoke rose upward. He then removed the wet shirt and repeated the action twice more. This was a code John had taught him to use if he ever needed help. Now all he could do was wait. He just hoped that John was outside and looking in the right direction. And that's where we'll stop. I hope he sees the smoke signals. You know, when I was writing this book, I did a lot of research on how to send smoke signals. So using what I put in the book, you actually could send smoke signals that way. Very interesting. Thank you, Bookwormy. Have a wonderful evening and join us tomorrow. See you then.